imagine the Congress's role, the role of the people's branch, basically being to vote yes or no on the decisions made by 28 unelected people, most of whom were appointed by someone who wasn't elected either? Americans would burn this motherfucker down before we let that happen.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the 204th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is the first time you're listening to Congressional Dish, this is the podcast that I started over 7 years ago because, well, I realized that I knew nothing about my own government, especially my branch in the U.S. federal government, Congress, and I had and still have many questions about our role in the world. Now, this show has definitely evolved over the years, and most episodes are directly connected to the U.S. Congress in some way. But I'm going to stray a little bit for this episode because I recently took a trip to Europe during an intense time politically, and I had some questions that, well, my soul just couldn't rest until I took the time to answer them. And so I'm going to share the answers with you. And so what happened is that I took a trip to Europe with my mom in mid-October, and while we were there were negotiations that happened between the European Union and the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom was supposed to leave the European Union on October 31st. So Brexit was supposed to happen on Halloween. And it turns out that it didn't happen. The deadline has been pushed again until January 2020. But it was another one of those experiences where I realized how little I knew about the background of what was going on all around me. And so this is one of those episodes where I just answer some of my own questions, notably about the structure of the European Union. I was definitely curious about the reasons why people in the United Kingdom who are currently in the European Union would want to leave the European Union, but at the same time, why I personally witnessed tens of thousands of people marching in London demanding that their government stay in the European Union. What I realized in that experience is that I didn't really know anything about the European Union, and that meant that I couldn't really understand the arguments on either side. And not understanding something that significant makes me actually insane, and then I get obsessed. And so I turned that crazy energy into an episode. In fact, that's really what this entire podcast has been, if I'm being honest about it. It's an attempt to keep myself out of the loony bin by getting my anxious political energy out in a constructive way. But anyway, on October 19th, on Super Saturday, as they called it. And as some of you saw in my Instagram story, if you want to follow me on Instagram, @JenBriney. But I joined the Remain protesters and I talked to a bunch of them about why they were there. But before and after my protest adventures, I was watching the debate that was taking place live on television in the UK Parliament. And I was genuinely surprised to learn that the United States was a part of their debate. And so in the second half of this episode, after I talk about the EU, I'm going to share with you some of the sound clips from those debates, because it's fascinating to hear how our country is being discussed in other parts of the world. It's like you never really know what your reputation is until you hear people talking about you behind your back. And in this case, I was able to record what they were saying. And so I'm going to share that international gossip with you too. Before I do that, though, this show is listener supported. And as regular listeners know, we're riding out a bit of a rough patch. And I just want to remind you at the top of this early November episode that the show definitely needs your support. And there's one way in particular that you can support the show this time of year that works out well for all of us. And that's by buying some merchandise from the Congressional Dish store. The company that we use for our merchandise is called TeePublic, and they just sent me their holiday sale calendar. And essentially, there's going to be sales running pretty much all the time between now and Christmas, with the biggest sales, of course, taking place on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, which is why I wanted to tell you about this today, because those are coming up pretty soon. And so for those of you that have never seen the Congressional Dish store, we have a lot of options in there. First of all, we have the Congressional Dish designs. So we have t-shirts and other stuff with the logo. We have episode level cover art because Brian is an important member of my team and he gives us a different piece of art for every single episode, and some of them are phenomenal. So we put some of our favorites in the store so you can put them on t-shirts or whatever else you want. And we also have 2 more designs up there, one for the golf swing lovers and one for the golf swing haters. But there's also a lot of other designs in there as well, because I went around TeePublic and just found a bunch of designs that I liked and that I figured that people who enjoy this show, you might like them too. So there's a couple of pages of all kinds of designs in there. And one of the things I want to highlight for you is that you don't have to keep the shirt in the color as it's exhibited for you on the front page. If you click on the design, you can really get most of these designs in any color you want. They're really customizable. And that goes for the kind of shirt too. So there's not only, standard t-shirts, but there's t-shirts for men and women. There's hoodies, tank tops, a bunch of different styles. My favorite ones are the really, really soft ones. And I wear them all the time, not because they're Congressional Dish shirts, but because they're actually my favorite shirts. They are that soft and I love them. So that's cool with the apparel. But it's also more than shirts. We also have mugs. So the Fire Them All mug still in there. We have stickers, phone cases, laptop cases, magnets, notebooks, posters, pillows, reusable bags, all kinds of stuff. So just scroll down to see those. And the thing I love about when people buy the Congressional Dish merchandise is that it helps me with marketing. Because when you have a sticker on your laptop, or if you're wearing the shirt, people will ask you, what's Congressional Dish? And that's an opportunity for one more person to learn about the show. And you guys know that I don't do any marketing. I don't like it. I don't necessarily want to be famous. In fact, I don't want to be famous. And so I do no marketing for this show. I spend all of my time researching and just working on making the best episodes I can. And I leave the marketing to you. So buying stuff from the store helps in both of those ways, because the show gets a commission when you buy stuff. And then the show also gets your marketing help. Now, if you want to find the store, you can find it on congressionaldish.com, along with all of the other options for paying for this episode with cash, which is always needed and appreciated. Because basically, if this episode and past episodes don't get paid for, well, then I don't plan to do too many future ones. So please pay for the podcast. And every single person that does pay gets thanked and can have a brief message. Let's make these a little bit more brief, but a brief message, a question or comment read on the bonus thank you episodes that I publish pretty much whenever I want to. But yeah, please go to the store. Please contribute to the show. It is definitely needed, especially around this time of year. We're not having the best year so far. So thank you for helping me keep this podcast going. All right. So now let's get to the good stuff. And I want to start this episode off with a super basic explanation of the European Union. And I want to put a disclaimer on this because the European Union has a lot more parts that I'm going to discuss, and it's more complicated than I'm going to make it sound. This isn't intended to be a full examination of the European Union. So this isn't going to be like the Federal Reserve episode where I really did set out to try and truly understand it and explain it in full. When it comes to the European Union, what I really want to know and felt like I needed to know is who has the most control in this system, and is it a democratic system? Like as an American, is it a system that I would want to be a part of by comparing it to my own? Basically, I wanted to understand from a more informed perspective the decision that the citizens of the United Kingdom were asked to make in 2016. Would I want to be a part of the European Union, or would I want to leave? And so to understand that choice, it's kind of essential to know what the damn thing is and where it came from. And so, what is the European Union? Well, as is the case with so many of the international communities that are attempting to rule the world today, the European Union was born in the 1950s in the wake of World War II. In the 1950s, it was called the European Economic Community, and it was originally just 6 countries: Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And the countries agreed back then to partner with each other and surrender some sovereignty in doing so in a limited number of areas, specifically coal and steel production, trade, and nuclear energy. That was it. But over the years, treaty by treaty, it's expanded to 28 countries, and it's no longer just governing limited economic laws. Since it was started as the European Economic Community, it has expanded to include other policies, including the environment and health, security, justice, and migration. And so the name was changed in 1993 to the European Union to more accurately reflect that expansion. And it's not done expanding. New countries are currently attempting to get in. And so to be eligible for EU membership, countries must first meet a set of established criteria, including having what the elites who rule the EU consider a functioning democracy. But probably more importantly, the country has to have a market economy. Now, for the last 100 episodes or so, I've developed a fascination with the economic system that's being pushed upon the entire world by the organizations that make up the World Trade System, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And they label their economic system a market economy system. Now, Investopedia defines a market economy as one where individuals and businesses guide the pricing of goods and services instead of the government. It's one where governments are actually supposed to play as little a role as possible. And the laws of supply and demand, despite the fact that they're not actually laws, but I digress, but the laws of supply and demand, that's what's supposed to make the economic decisions through voluntary transactions with individuals and businesses. And it sounds nice, but in practice, the reason this topic ended up on my radar is that it has equaled a lot of freedom for businesses to operate however they please, exploiting workers, pillaging resources, and using their economic powers to buy governments and the militaries of those governments, especially ours, to secure corporate resources when the local peasants don't play nice. Which is why seeing a market economy as one of the prerequisites for EU membership stands out to me so starkly. You can't be a part of the EU without local economic laws that adhere to market economy, free market, neoliberal, whatever you want to label the system and its laws. But you have to pledge allegiance to it to be in the EU. And so one question, which isn't surprising but is now answered, was, is the European Union a part of that one global economic system game? Yes. In fact, right on the EU's website, it says, quote, beyond its borders, the EU is also committed to liberalizing world trade, unquote. And so there you go. And so once a country becomes an official candidate by at least looking like a democracy, and you'll understand why I say that oozing with sarcasm in a few minutes, but once a country looks like it's a democracy and adheres to enough of the economic laws to qualify as a market economy, then that triggers a complex process in which the country has to adopt and implement a massive list of EU laws and regulations. At its core, the European Union is about a constantly expanding group of countries surrendering some of their national level rights to make their own local laws in order to be pieces of a larger bloc with similar laws and rules, but more global power. And it is ever expanding. The EU started with 6 countries, like I said, and now there are 28, and 5 more countries are currently recognized by the EU as official candidates for membership. And they're currently in the process of changing their laws to please the EU masters. Those countries are Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Turkey. And so why do these countries do this? Well, the thing is that there are some real benefits for the citizens, especially if they're people like me who like to try new things and move around and would basically rather die than stay in their hometown their entire lives. The European Union, as it exists today, serves a lot of the positive functions that having the U.S. federal government does for us Americans. In some ways, the nickname the United States of Europe, which I heard it get called in the British Parliament and on the streets, well, the nickname kind of fits. Because all EU citizens have the right and freedom to choose which EU country they want to live and work in, just like any American can live and work in whichever state we choose. When an EU citizen moves to another country within the EU, every EU country must treat that EU citizen in exactly the same way as it treats its own citizens for employment, social security, and tax purposes. And every EU citizen has the right to vote and be a candidate for elected office in both local and European elections in the EU country where they choose to live, under the same conditions as people from that country originally. Just like how I, as a Californian, can go to Kentucky, put my name on the ballot for the House of Representatives tomorrow in that state, despite the fact that I've never even been to Kentucky before. On top of that, 19 out of the 28 EU countries also share a common currency, the euro. Just like how all of the United States use the dollar. And the Europeans' fiat currency is controlled by the European Central Bank, just like how our money backed by nothing of actual value is controlled by the Federal Reserve. And if you want to know more about that, one of the masterpieces of Congressional Dish is episode 201, WTF is the Federal Reserve. It's one of the best episodes I've ever done. Check that out. On top of all of those benefits, there's also the Schengen zone, which includes 22 out of the 28 countries, where people can physically move in and out of those countries without having to be stopped and checked at the border. And this affects us Americans as tourists or even temporary European residents because we only need one visa and we get access to all of those 22 countries. And I lived in Europe. Actually, I've done it twice. The first time I lived in Germany in 2003 for almost 6 months. And then I lived in Europe again, backpacking the whole time in 2008 for 3 months. And I do intend to live there again. And this last trip just made it crystal clear that that's where I want to be for an extended while. And so I looked up the rules. And so as American tourists, we don't have to apply for a visa, at least for now. Right now, our passports basically allow us into the 22 Schengen countries for 3 months out of every 6. And so the minute we step foot in Europe, a 180-day clock starts ticking. And it doesn't matter the order of the days. You can come in and out, but you can only spend 90 of the next 180 days in the Schengen zone. But that doesn't mean that we have to leave the EU. We can ride out those other 90 days in an EU country or countries that are not a part of the Schengen zone, but are still in the EU. And so once the 180-day clock has expired, then we can go back into Schengen for 90 more days. And the clock resets. And so, for example, right now, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Romania, they're all in the European Union, but they're not Schengen, which means that I can, for example, go to France, a Schengen country, for 90 days, and then I can go to Croatia, a EU country that's not Schengen, for 90 days. Then I can go back to Germany, a Schengen country, for 90 days. And then I can go to Ireland, an EU country that's not Schengen, for 90 days. And I can play this game indefinitely, staying in the European Union the entire time. Now, that's the case right now, but that's going to change by the end of 2021. The EU has announced that starting by the end of 2021, it could be earlier than that, but sometime in 2021, United States citizens before traveling to Europe will have to apply for a European Travel Information and Authorization System visa waiver to travel to any of the Schengen countries. To get the visa, we're going to have our passports, which we have to have already. But we also, before we go, have to fill out an application and pay a fee. That's what's going to be new for us. Now, the EU says that the application should take about 20 minutes to complete, and they're not telling us yet how much the fee is going to be. Once we fill out this new application and get approved and pay the fee, the visa waiver will allow us to play the 90-day in, 90-day out game for 3 years before we'll have to either get this visa waiver again or apply for a longer-term visa. And there's actually a lot of options for staying longer with different visas, especially for digital nomads like me, people that bring their jobs with them and are not trying to work by taking a job of someone in the EU. But the bottom line is that when I went to Europe a few weeks ago, I bought the ticket, had my passport, got on the plane. The end. Starting in 2021, it will be more expensive and it will be more of a hassle. And so if you're planning to go, it's easiest to do it sooner than later. And if you want to stay for more than 90 days, you can ride out the gaps in the EU countries that aren't Schengen. And I personally have my eye on Croatia because I found a dog-friendly, fully furnished 2-bedroom Airbnb on the water in Dubrovnik for less than half of what I'm paying now to be in the moderate to shitty air of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I can't stop thinking about it. And Croatia wants to be Schengen. Like I said, it's in the EU, but it's not Schengen, and it's on its way to approval. But the thing is that there are so many ways for the other surrounding countries to slam the brakes on a new country entering the Schengen zone because the vote has to be unanimous to let anyone new in. And so for Croatia, because they're already in line, I guess, they could be in the Schengen zone as early as 2020, but there are a lot of reasons why it could stall out for many, many years. And so if you care about the details of that, I put an article from Total Croatia News in the show notes that breaks down the details. It's really fascinating, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because I know a lot of people don't care. But if Croatia goes Schengen before I can get my nomadic ass out to Europe, I'd probably have to hang out in like Bulgaria or Romania in the winter months because, you know, winter in England and Ireland. And I guess I'm fine with that, but like, I want Croatia. I like the ocean and sun and sand. And so I'm hoping that Schengen stalls at 22 countries for purely selfish reasons, because it really works out for us tourists to have some countries that are EU, but not in that zone because of the 90-day game. But the truth is that I really have no right to an opinion on any of this, and I'm just dreaming out loud here. But the point is that the fact that there are European countries that are not Schengen works in the favor of us American peasants. And as usual, international relations are clearly all about me. Okay, back to the serious stuff. Freedom of movement. That is a key benefit to peasants, domestic and foreign. But for EU citizens, there's some real freedom for individuals in the standardized non-economic rules of the European Union, even if it means that they have to give up some freedom on the nation level. And where the nations really give up their freedom is in the economy, in trade. Because the main function of the European Union is that all of the European Union countries share a customs union, which means that food, clothes, all kinds of physical crap can move tax-freely between the countries, just like how our crap can move tax-freely between each of the United States. And to make that work, no member country can negotiate its own international trade agreements. When it comes to trade agreements, and which we learned from the TPP episodes a few years ago, trade agreements aren't all about trade. They govern all kinds of policy. And when it comes to those agreements, the European Union is in charge. The nations are basically sidelined in their own affairs, and that's a pretty big deal. And so if a group was going to have that much power over your country, a country that at one time was free to sign whatever treaty it wanted, if your nation is going to give that up to a larger organization based on the principles of democracy and a market economy, well, the democracy part is what my peasant ass is concerned with. And so who are these EU overlords? Who's calling the shots at the EU? Who's at the top? Well, this is where the nickname United States of Europe goes astray, because unlike our country, where we get to vote directly for the people who make the decisions, we vote for our members of Congress and the president. Even though I know the Republican and the Democratic parties have rigged the rules in a way that their insiders have way too much control over who the top two candidates will be. But we peasants, we do get to vote for the most favored of the top two, the most powerful person. And you know that our votes count. Because the lizards wanted Hillary and we have President Trump. So our votes do matter. And we not only vote for, the most powerful, the president, but we vote for many more powerful people directly. And it's not like that in the EU. The most powerful group of people in the EU are the 28 people on the European Commission. 28 because it's a group of one commissioner for each of the 28 EU countries. These 28 people make the most important decisions. They propose the laws, so they get to write the first drafts of laws, just like our members of Congress do here in the States. And they write the budget, just like our members of Congress do here in the States. On top of that, the European Commission negotiates trade agreements with all the other countries and trading blocs on behalf of the entire European Union. Here in the States, that's done by the executive branch officials, and then Congress is supposed to be able to amend the agreements unless Congress strips itself of its own power by giving the president fast track authority, which they did during the Obama years, and now Trump has it. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a whole rabbit hole. And so I'll put episode 96 in the show notes. That's from 2015 when fast track became law. And that'll give you all the details of how our Congress surrendered their trade agreement power to the executive branch until July of 2021. But anyway, back to the EU. These 28 people on the European Commission have powers that our government has given to the Congress, the People's Branch, and the executive branch. But these 28 people get their power in a far less democratic way. You see, the 28 commissioners are appointed, not elected, appointed by the European Commission president. The European Commission president is appointed by the European Council, which are the heads of each of the countries, and therefore, the European Council is elected based on the rules of their country, but it is elected for the most part by their people. So if the United States were part of the EU, Donald Trump would probably be our representative on the European Council. And so the presidents and prime ministers on the European Council, they pick the European Commission president. And then the representatives of the peasants at the European Parliament, the Parliament being the European Union's version of Congress. Well, Parliament can vote yes or no on that pick. But the peasants and their representatives in Parliament really have no guaranteed role in the nomination process. The elites get to choose the European Commission president, and the representatives get to approve or disapprove. The voters can only watch. If the majority of the representatives in the European Parliament approve the European Commission president, chosen by the presidents and prime ministers from the EU countries, then the European Commission president, the most powerful person in the EU, is considered elected. And so to be clear, the voters play no role in the nominating process for the most powerful person in the EU, the European Commission president, and they don't get to vote on the person nominated. The only role the voters have to play in that process is that they can ask their representative in Parliament to vote a certain way. That's it. And so that's the process. Now we have a European Commission president, undemocratically elected. And now we need the other 27 members of the European Commission. How are they chosen? Well, the European Commission president picks them. The closest the voters get to having a say in that process is that the European Parliament, the European version of Congress, gets to approve or disapprove of the entire commission all at once. It's all or nothing. So Parliament doesn't get to vote on the individual commission members like they did for the president. And once again, the voters play no role in the nomination or approval process at all. Now, this shift change at the top of the EU takes place every 5 years. And so here in the States, our president switches every 4. And so there's less turnover in the EU than there is here in the States. And it's extremely difficult for Parliament, the representatives of the people, to dismiss the commission. To even start the process, Parliament has to vote to censure the commission, and it's been tried 8 times. It's never been successful. And so that part of the EU structure alone raises major red flags for me. I mean, can you imagine trying to change our system to look like the EU? 28 unelected people being given similar powers to Congress? They get to write the bills, which I do have to say Parliament has a role in amending and approving the bills, but the bills come from the European Commission. And as Mitch McConnell has proven here in the States, the power to determine what gets a vote is an immense power. And then those same 28 unelected people do the budget writing. They have the power of the purse, with the people's representatives, again, having some amending and approval power, but 28 people, unelected, get to write the draft. Can you imagine the Congress's role, the role of the people's branch, basically being to vote yes or no on the decisions made by 28 unelected people, most of whom were appointed by someone who wasn't elected either? Americans would burn this motherfucker down before we let that happen. But that's the basic structure of the most powerful branch of the European Union. And I can see why some peasants, if they're aware of this, would have a problem with it. I mean, here's a fairly stunning example of the kind of power the EU has given to the European Commission president and how it's being used in reality. So in an interview with Der Spiegel, which is an influential German publication, the current European Commission president, Jean-Claude Juncker, told this story, quote, "Trump told me about all the people from Europe who had already been to the Oval Office before me, the chancellor, presidents, prime ministers, and I told him, they're all important, but you spoke to the wrong people. The European Commission is responsible for trade policy, not the member states." That impressed him. Trump then responded, "I do not want an agreement at all with the European Union. I want an agreement with you." And I replied, "I am the European Union. The European Commission has the sole responsibility for trade matters. An agreement with me is an agreement with the EU," unquote. Now, ordinarily, the arrogance displayed by this guy swinging his big dick around the White House would be revolting, except he's right. This one unelected guy who is the most powerful man in Europe, who handpicked the other 27 most powerful people in the EU, he's cocky, but he's not wrong. He does have that level of power. And I'm legit embarrassed that as an American, that researching this episode is the first time I ever heard his name. He's been the most powerful person in all of Europe for 5 years, and I didn't know. We don't know shit about the rest of the world here in the States. And no wonder we don't know how to elect people to properly represent us in it. But anyway, this is why I react with an eye roll when I read that being a democracy is one of the 2 criteria for EU membership. The EU itself has a long way to go in its own democracy standards. So, democracy or market economy, which of these 2 criteria probably reigns supreme in a system structured like this? And as far as the structure of the EU goes, that's about as far as I care to go with this particular rabbit hole. There are lots of other parts of the EU government, but the European Commission is the most powerful, and that's how it's elected. So that pretty much answers my questions about the level of democracy and voter participation in the EU. There's a lot to be desired. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this episode right now is that it's shift change time at the European Union at the European Commission level. The most powerful person in the European Union, big dick swinging Jean-Claude Juncker, was supposed to step down on November 1st, but he didn't. And so first of all, that can happen in their system. A scheduled transition of power can just be postponed. But when Jean-Claude Juncker, Mr. I am the European Union, does eventually step aside, which is now scheduled to happen on December 1st, He's going to transfer his immense power to German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen. Her appointment has been controversial, and she's struggling to get her picks for the European Commission approved because people are pissed that she was chosen behind closed doors by the EU leaders in a move that is totally allowed, but breaks some recent promises that were supposed to make the EU seem more democratic. Because the unofficial rule recently adopted is that the candidate for European Commission president is supposed to be chosen by the party that wins the most seats in parliament. But that norm has only been a thing since the last transition in 2014, and they skipped that this time. So that democracy-boosting rule lasted exactly one cycle before being tossed aside for the ease of allowing the presidents and prime ministers of the European Council to pick the most powerful person in Europe behind closed doors. Democracy. And so the transition was just shifted to December 1st. Maybe. There's no guarantee that it'll happen then either, so we'll just have to wait and see. Not that any of this will be reported in the United States. But when she does take over, the most powerful person in Europe will be a woman whose main accomplishment as defense minister in Germany was to expand the German military economically and physically. Her main achievement was eliminating a cap on the number of troops in their standing army and giving the army more money. Most importantly, though, she is openly supportive of and participating in the expansion of the European Union to include a defense union. And this matters and affects us Americans because the ball has been rolling towards Europe having its own military for a while now, even though that's been consistently denied by European elites. But actions speak louder than words, and so here's some actions. Starting in 1999, the EU has had a common security and defense policy, expanding its policy coordination beyond trade and electricity and into matters of war. Since that policy expansion into war at the turn of the century, the EU has created 3 defense decision-making bodies and has developed a rapid reaction force and multinational battle groups. Now, the EU masters insist that this isn't a standing EU army. Instead, it's groups of troops and assets standing by at appropriate readiness levels drawn from existing national forces for EU operations. Troops standing by for European operations. That's not a standing army. How exactly? Just seems like semantics to me. So then on top of that, in 2004, the EU then established the European Defense Agency to help coordinate weapons purchasing policy. And now those weapons are purchased and developed with money from the European Defense Fund, which was created in 2016. And so over the course of the last 16 years, first came the war policy coordination, then came the war policy agencies, then came troops standing by, and then came a war fund. And this is concerning because, in theory, all of this is unnecessary if Europe is defended by NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is the international military alliance created after World War II that we are a part of. So the United States is a part of NATO, but not the EU, which means that NATO and not the EU is tied to us militarily. So, like when we got attacked on 9/11, that's how NATO countries, a lot of them European countries, ended up fighting in Afghanistan, because if one NATO country is attacked, it's considered an attack on us all. This is how the countries of Europe got sucked into the W. Bush and Obama wars. But the NATO countries of Europe also get huge benefits from our participation in Europe, even if they get sucked into, unnecessary wars sometimes. Because the United States, despite being one of 29 countries in NATO, contributes almost a quarter of the NATO funding. So it is totally accurate to say that us United States peasants are subsidizing the defense and wars of Europe. No one in Europe wants us to stop paying more than our fair share for their defense. But as far as the European Union is concerned, each EU country is its own thing in NATO. The European Commission doesn't call any shots or really have any power within the NATO structure. And so if the EU wants to keep our tax money flowing to Europe to protect their borders and pay for proxy wars with Russia with them, like, I don't know, the civil war we're funding in Ukraine via NATO, well then the EU leaders need to claim that their incremental steps towards an EU army aren't really what they clearly are. The EU has every reason to want to have its own military outside of NATO. The leaders of the EU have every reason to want the power to send out peasant soldiers on their command and independent of the US while still using our tax money for defense. So it's a balancing act. They've got to keep us funding NATO while slowly building, boiling frog style, their side military that we'll have no role in. And so the denials of the obvious that the EU is incrementally creating its own military make perfect sense to me in that context. And the desire of Europe to have its own military independent of NATO also makes perfect sense to me too. NATO has 29 countries signed up so far, with a lot of crossover between the European Union countries, but not total crossover with NATO. Only 22 of the 28 European countries are in NATO. And so, like I said, that's a lot of crossover, but 6 EU countries are not in our shared military union, and that makes things messy. And so let's take Turkey, for example. Turkey is in NATO. It's a military partner, but it's not in the EU. And so if Turkey were attacked, or if it, invades its next door neighbor and war erupts, well, that leaves the EU leaders in the position of having to send some of the countries, most of the countries, to defend a country that isn't actually a part of the EU club. And then the opposite is true for Cyprus. Cyprus is a part of the EU, but it's not a part of NATO. And so if Cyprus were to get attacked, it's not in the military union, and so NATO isn't legally obligated to defend it. If the EU can't call up troops on its own, Cyprus could be fucked. And so it's messy when your military union and your everything else union doesn't perfectly align. And that's where the EU finds itself today. And the fact that the EU elites, behind closed doors and without meaningful input from the people's branch of government, picked the German defense minister who is openly pushing for an EU defense union as their president, when she takes over, well, that's something to watch and keep in mind when we look at the relationship with Europe that we have in matters of war. The fact is that an EU army would diminish the power of NATO and therefore our military power in Europe. And that's some important context to keep in mind after this coming shift change. And there was one more shift change that I'd like to highlight, and it's a transition that did happen on schedule. Christine Lagarde, who since 2011 has been the head of the World Trade System's International Monetary Fund, the organization that gives huge loans to governments in return for them changing their economic laws in a way that diminishes the power of the state, reduces benefits for the people, and opens the country to multinational corporations for privatizations and pillaging. Well, she just became the head of the European Central Bank, the central bank for the fiat currency of Europe, the euro. And just like with the European Commission, she was appointed by the European Council, the presidents and prime ministers of member countries, and voters had no say. Although in this area, our system is no better. As I explained in detail in the Federal Reserve episode, voters in the United States are just as far removed from the process of picking the person who manipulates our dollar as the Europeans are removed from picking the person who manipulates the euro. But, quick tangent here. But in between jobs, Christine Lagarde was interviewed by John Dickerson on 60 Minutes. And since she is one of the most powerful of the lizards trying to get the whole world to be one private sector favoring economic system, I found this comment to be just fascinating in explaining her worldview. And to be clear, I don't think any of the lizard people who are trying to economically control the world are evil. They're arrogant for damn sure. But I think they think that they're doing good in the world. And so here's the good she thinks she's doing in the world.
Nationalism in Europe is associated with very, very horrible developments that always led to war.
You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay?
President Trump has called himself a nationalist. He's proud of the nationalist label. This is a big debate. This is the central debate, you could argue, on the global stage, as countries decide maybe this idea of interconnectedness is not so wonderful.
International trade, connections, movement of people and movement of capital has taken hundreds of millions out of poverty. Now, some people in the advanced economies might say, "Pooh, what do I care?" Well, of course we care for the person next door. And because of the interconnections, next door is not down the pathway. Next door is everywhere around the world. And if my neighbors from across a border are feeling desperate, are starving, are fighting, there will be consequences back at home.
And while she was saying that, I couldn't help but think of my actual neighbors, the people living in tents, walking distance from where I now sit. You know, we're spending hundreds of billions a year to defend this economic system and push this economic system, while more and more of my actual neighbors move into tents. And I don't think it makes me a terrible person that I care more about the people I pass on the street every day than people on the other side of the world. My local community is suffering. I've been here in the California Bay Area for 5 years now, and it's definitely gotten worse. And it's not just here. It's happening all over this country, in cities on both coasts and in Middle America, especially in cities where it's warm. That's the disconnect that I can't get over when I hear her speak about nationalism, dividing ourselves by country. When I hear her say that caring about your nation on a nation level is a bad thing. How else are we supposed to take care of our local communities if not with local or even national governments? So, if my community needs to suffer, if my actual next door neighbor, if Dave or the drunk guy we refer to as the dude, because he's totally the dude, but if Dave or the dude need to move into tents because our tax money is spent to move factories to a country on the other side of the world, providing a person over there with a few extra dollars per day, coincidentally also saving the company that moved billions in labor, which is then passed out to shareholders. But I don't think I should be sorry for saying that system. We're not supposed to say this. We're supposed to say that ending poverty all over the world is super important. Although I think that whole argument is cover for allowing multinationals to move overseas chasing cheap labor. I think it's just lip service. But even if the motivation really is ending poverty in poor countries, even if that's legit, I care about Dave and the dude more than the person on the other side of the world. And I think most of us peasants care about the peasants in our actual neighborhoods more too. I think that's the truth of it. That's just not what we're allowed to say. And it's not our desire, us peasants, our desire to take care of our American neighbors before the rest of the world that leads to war in the times we live in now. The lizards always focus on World War II, but it's their economic system, their desire to free the markets, to free the companies of regulations in every country that they want to operate in. It's the pursuit of her goals as head of the IMF, their pursuit of a global economic system that has killed so many in recent times. So many people that didn't want it, like in Iraq and Libya and Syria and Ukraine and El Salvador and Chile, and the list goes on and on. Why don't those wars count to these people? Why does every death since World War II just get brushed aside as if they don't matter? So yeah, I just got super annoyed with her definition of neighbor. It's such a weird way to think that the neighbors that matter are the ones in like Bangladesh, Unless I guess you're someone like Christine Lagarde with so much fucking money that traveling across the world is a no big deal expense. How could she possibly understand the economics of how us peasants live? Poof, she can't. And now she's in charge of manipulating Europe's fiat currency. It's like a lizard merry-go-round in the global power positions. It really is. And so, since Christine Lagarde has resigned from the IMF and moved over to the European Central Bank, that means that we also have a new person in charge of the International Monetary Fund. That person is now Kristalina Georgieva. I might be saying that wrong, but Kristalina of Bulgaria is a former EU commissioner. She's one of the elite 28, who then became the number 2 person at the World Bank before moving over to the International Monetary Fund. And so basically, Christine of the World Trade System moved to the EU, and Kristalina of the EU moved to the World Trade System, which made me wonder, what is the relationship between these two systems? Because that's a lot of crossover. Well, as far as the hierarchy of power goes, the World Trade Organization is at the top. The World Trade Organization sets the global rules. And there are approximately 196 countries, approximately, because like with Palestine, there are some countries that exist in a geopolitical gray area. And so we're going to go with 196 countries on Earth. There are 164 countries in the World Trade Organization. And so that means that 84% of countries in the world are beholden to the economic laws of the World Trade System. Pretty damn close to global. You got to give them credit. And since the World Trade Organization officially became a thing in 1995, each of the 28 nations that make up the European Union have been a part of the WTO. On top of that, the European Union itself, so like as an organization, has been its own WTO member. And so that gives the European Union a total of 29 WTO members. But here's the thing. The European Commission, the 28 unelected people that I described earlier, They alone speak for all of the EU members at almost all WTO meetings and negotiate for all of the EU countries on almost all WTO affairs. And so, because every single current member of the EU is also a member of the WTO, if one of them, like, let's say the United Kingdom, were to leave the European Union, it's not like they could just go and make trade agreements as they see fit. Instead, they're obligated to operate under World Trade Organization economic laws. And so they don't actually get their economic sovereignty back by leaving the EU, which is something that the people that I met at the Remain protest in London explained to me. And so in some ways, switching to WTO rules could serve to limit the United Kingdom's options. Because, for example, the most important WTO principle is that countries are not allowed to discriminate between countries that are also in the WTO. So basically, every WTO country has to treat every other WTO country equally. And this rule is actually what put the WTO on my radar to begin with. Another episode that I'll put in the show notes for you is from 2015. It's episode 102, the World Trade Organization, COOL. And COOL stands for Country of Origin Labels. And in a bill that eventually got dingleberried into law on a funding law, our Congress eliminated the requirement that beef and pork producers tell us which country our meat is from on the food labels. And this shocked me because I know of exactly 0 peasants who were passionately arguing that we shouldn't know where our food comes from. And so why would Congress do this? Well, because of WTO rules. It turns out that Canada and Mexico sued us in World Trade System Court, saying that requiring their producers in Canada and Mexico to label their meat while U.S. producers didn't have to label the meat was unequal treatment. And they won in WTO court and were therefore allowed to impose tariffs on U.S. beef and pork. And so Congress decided to bow to our WTO masters and repeal the requirements. Even though requiring labels from U.S. producers was another option, but I digress. The point is that U.S. consumers are no longer told where our beef and pork is from because of a WTO ruling and a Congress full of pussies. And that pissed me off and made me look into what the World Trade Organization is and why its rulings are ending up with changes to our laws that Americans don't want. And that is a rabbit hole that has been deeper than anything I ever could have imagined. And so, back to the EU, when or if the UK actually pulls off Brexit and leaves the EU, if the UK government, for example, didn't do border checks on goods crossing the Irish border, which is important because Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom. And so they would have to put up an actual border on the Irish island. And there was a nasty war in my lifetime fought over that very issue. But if they didn't put up a border between the UK and Ireland, then the UK would not be allowed to check products arriving into UK ports from the US, China, India, or anywhere else in the world if those countries are part of the WTO. You know, Dems the WTO rules. And so leaving the EU, it's not like the UK or any other EU country can just leave and then make whatever deals they want. They'll still have WTO overlords. And so the question really is, who do the residents of the United Kingdom want to surrender their sovereignty to? Does the UK want to surrender sovereignty to the European Union, which does have those benefits for individuals like the ability to freely travel and live with equal rights in all the EU countries, but then also forces rules and regulations on all kinds of other policy upon them? Or do they want to get out of the EU, which is as undemocratic a system as it's accused of being, and instead be governed economically, but not really policy-wise by the WTO? That was the choice given to voters in the UK in 2016, although I know it wasn't framed that way. But regardless of what the local debate was, on June 23rd, 2016, the voters in the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. But it wasn't exactly a landslide. Almost 52% of the voters chose to leave the EU, but that means that 48% voted to remain. And the country is definitely divided, and that was crystal clear in the UK Parliament, on television programs, and on the streets of London. But the fact is that the voters got a say, and a clear but slim majority voted to leave. And ever since, they've been trying to figure out how to do it. Now, this whole situation was made possible by the Lisbon Treaty, which was ratified by the EU countries in 2009. For the first time in EU history, the Lisbon Treaty contained an exit clause from the European Union, Article 50, which created the procedures for a country to leave the EU. The way it works is that the country has to notify the European Council of its intention to leave. That notification then triggers a 2-year period for withdrawal negotiations with extensions allowed. And so the United Kingdom invoked Article 50 and notified the European Council of its intention to leave in March 2017, which meant that Brexit was supposed to be done by March of this year, 2019. Well, since January 2019, the UK Parliament has rejected the withdrawal agreements negotiated between the EU and the British Prime Minister 3 times. And in April 2019, at the UK's request, EU leaders agreed to extend the Brexit deadline to October 31st, 2019. Now, the Prime Minister at this moment is Boris Johnson, who is someone who has always been on Team Brexit and who promised to get it done. And so while I was in London in mid-October, Boris Johnson created a deal very quickly with the European Union. That deal was solidified during meetings in Brussels that ended on Friday, October 18th. And so with the Brexit deadline of October 31st fast approaching, a deadline that coincided with the scheduled shift change at the European Union. So if it got extended, they're now dealing with a whole new group of people. Well, Parliament in the UK decided to meet on a Saturday to vote on Boris Johnson's deal. Or at least that was the intent. In the end, they didn't end up voting that day at all on the deal. The vote that did happen essentially served to force another extension. And so long story short, the extension was granted for 3 more months, and the new Brexit deadline is January 31st, 2020. Also, because this parliament couldn't get Brexit done, there's going to be an early election in December in the United Kingdom, with the idea being that a new UK parliament might have a better chance of getting shit done one way or another, since this parliament is clearly stuck. And I really don't want to get into any more detail than that because this is not a show about the United Kingdom's politics. But I do want to play some clips for you from that Saturday session that I found fascinating as an American. Starting with this one from the House of Lords debate that day. This is Lord Newby.
My Lords, your Lordship's House is sitting on a Saturday today for the first time since 1983 and only the 4th time in 80 years. These occasions have typically been to debate a serious foreign threat to the vital interests of the United Kingdom, the outbreak of the Second World War, Suez, the Falklands. Today, we sit on a Saturday to try to resolve a serious internal threat to the unity and future of the Conservative Party. There is no reason, other than the Prime Minister's macho commitment to leave the EU by the 31st of October, for the government's decision to recall Parliament today. Such a timetable is a complete abuse of the parliamentary process. It doesn't allow the appropriate impact assessments to be made, it doesn't allow the relevant select committees to consider the proposals, and it doesn't allow the Commons and your Lordship's House to give proper consideration to the withdrawal bill. It barely gives us time to read and compare the documents. The withdrawal agreement itself, some 535 pages, was available for the first time for noble lords to pick up from the printed paper office just this morning. And so we certainly have not had time to identify and work out what some of the changes mean. For example, the sections in the political declaration on dispute settlement and the forward process have been substantially rewritten. Why? Parliament today is being asked to approve these changes with no effective ability to question ministers on them. It is a disgrace.
Which I kind of loved from a misery loves company standpoint. I mean, how many times have we seen our sorry excuses for representatives try, and often succeed, to ram through a bill so long that it's impossible to read? I mean, they do it every damn year here in the colonies with our government funding laws. And so to see the same game played in another government just made me feel like solidarity with our peasant brothers and sisters in the UK. You know, it's kind of comforting in a sick way to know that other countries' governments are just as disgraceful as our own. But when it comes to our own government, this current one in particular, there was a theme when it was discussed. And this is just one example of many, but this type of talk was definitely a theme. This is Baroness Ludford, who is someone who would like to remain in the European Union.
You know, Lady the Leader spoke of the wonderful perspective of international trade deals. President Trump has just imposed a 25% tariff on imports of single malt whisky. Smaller independent whisky producers face having their, quote, feet taken out from under them, said one. Compare this with how the EU has used its clout to lever open markets in Asia for Scotch whisky that were previously heavily protected by tariff walls. We cannot trust President Trump.
And that's a sentiment I think most of us who aren't straight up mouth-breathing Trump lovers can, at a minimum, understand. None of us know what Trump is going to do from one day to the next. He's unpredictable, and that's true whether you love him or you hate him. But unpredictability is not a quality that builds trust, and that is being said openly and often overseas. It's not surprising, but it's still a bit of a gut punch to hear how little the President of the United States is trusted as an American watching television overseas. But there was another theme related to our country that did catch me by surprise, and it was this one. This is Jeremy Corbyn in the House of Commons.
This deal, Mr. Speaker, would inevitably and absolutely inevitably lead to a Trump trade deal, forcing the UK to diverge from the highest standards and expose our families once again to chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-treated beef.
Now, I think most of us who pay any attention to food safety or even labels on our food know that our cows are pumped full of hormones. I mean, look at the milk in your fridge. Lots of milk companies voluntarily put on their labels that their cows are not treated with hormones because it's such a concern here in the States. And by the way, if your milk or other dairy or beef doesn't say that, well, don't be surprised if your baby is in the 200th percentile and is born with 3 tits. I'm just kidding. I have no idea what the effects of hormone-filled beef and dairy are. I just avoid hormone-treated anything, and I leave it at that. So, but anyway, we're aware of the beef situation and the hormones. But chlorine-washed chicken? What? And that made me kind of go, because I'm a Weight Watcher. And you probably know that by now. I'm very open about the fact that I'm a former fat who could easily blump up right now if I didn't keep track of every single morsel that I shove into my face. And as a Weight Watcher, I eat a lot of chicken. It's 0 points. And so this one stopped me in my tracks. What in the hell are they talking about when they talk about chlorine-washed chicken? Well, turns out that there's a documentary, a short but powerful one, that you can watch right now on Amazon Prime. And I'm pretty sure it's an episode of a British news show. It was hosted by someone named Kate Quilton. But the title of it on Amazon Prime is The Truth About Chlorinated Chicken. And here's a bit of the trailer.
As President Trump touches down in the UK, talk of a post-Brexit trade deal with the US is hotting up. And one of the most controversial items on the menu is whether we will have to accept American chemically washed chicken. It's been banned in the EU for 22 years, but now the US have made it one of their top priorities for a trade deal with the UK. But American chicken has been banned in the European Union for over 20 years. It costs the US economy up to an estimated $300 million a year in potential revenues. The debate around chlorinated chicken is about much more than just chicken. It's about food standards, it's about workers' rights, it's about animal welfare. And I suppose after Brexit, we have to ask ourselves, do we want high standards? Or do we want cheaper food?
I don't know about you, but I didn't know that American chicken has been banned in the EU for over 2 decades. And in this documentary, they show the difference between the way chicken must be handled in the EU by law and the way American chicken is allowed to be prepared. And I have to tell you that I'd prefer my food to be prepared in the EU regulation kind of way. Because basically, chlorinated chicken is referring to chickens that are washed with chlorine, which sounds kind of horrible, but we're told that it's safe, even in the EU, because the EU allows chlorine washing of vegetables. So it's not the chlorine wash itself it's the problem. The problem is apparently the effectiveness. There's evidence that this method of washing chicken leaves a lot of bacteria behind on the food. And in this documentary, the journalist sent a cameraman undercover as a worker in a Tyson chicken plant, and it's also just the amount of bad practices that are allowed that's stunning to me here in the United States. And I'll tell you that I'm never buying Tyson chicken again after watching it. It was bad. And Tyson is one of the most common brands of chicken in the United States. And so I'm definitely more concerned about the safety of my food here at home now than I was before I watched this 30-minute show. And so the concern that is being expressed in the UK, I'm sorry to say, I'm embarrassed to say that it's valid. And before I play this next clip, I do want to put the disclaimer on here that the statistics comparing the rates of food poisoning between the UK and the US are not entirely reliable because of different ways of recording illnesses, and there's different kinds of foodborne illnesses, etc. And so take what he says with a grain of salt. But what I want you to hear is what is being said about the prospect of leaving the EU and having a closer trading partnership with us. This is about our reputation in the world. This is Lord Rooker in the House of Lords.
The push for a free trade agreement with America, the food poisoning capital of the West, where food poisoning rates are 10 times the UK per head of population, will have consequences. And on a very minor point, as detail, I realise that, research published in the UK only last year proves that chlorine washing of food does not kill all the bugs. And that's the Microbiology Society. And given the United States of America, as over 400 people a year die of salmonella, compared to none here, it seems to be the case we're heading for very serious consequences of life and death.
And actually, according to our own Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, he was wrong. 450 Americans, not 400, die of salmonella in our country every year. But the point is that overseas, the effectiveness of our government in keeping us as consumers safe is viewed with suspicion. We don't have the highest standards, even though many, if not most of us, think that we do because it's repeated so often that we're number one in everything. We have to be aware of that reality in order to change it, and I don't think we are. In this last clip, this is the one that made me sit on my hotel room bed, pull out a pad of paper and write down the timestamp, and decide that one way or another I need to share this clip with you. This was during the peak of the main debate in the House of Commons. This is Keir Starmer.
But it's obvious where it leads, because once you've diverged, once you've moved out of alignment with the EU, trade becomes more difficult. I will just finish the point. Trade becomes more difficult, and the EU is not seen any longer as our priority in trade, and the gaze goes elsewhere to make up. I'll finish this point, if I may. I will finish this point. Because once you've moved out of alignment, you don't move back. And the further you move out, the less easy it is to trade with the EU 27. And once you've done that, you've broken the economic model we've been operating for decades. And once you've done that, you look elsewhere. And once you've done that, you look across to the United States. I will finish this point, and then I'll give way. The gaze goes across to the US, and that's a different economic model. It's not just another country, it's a different economic model, a deregulated model. In the US, 10 days is the holiday entitlement. Many, many contracts at work are called contracts at will. Hugely powerful corporate bodies have far more power than the workforce. So this is a political direction of travel, not a technical decision on the EU that takes us to a different economic model, one of deregulation, one of low standards, one where the balance between the workforce and corporate bodies gets far worse than it is now. I'll give way.
That's our reputation in the world. We have a deregulated economic model that others don't want because of the risks. Because we are worked so hard and we get so few days of vacation. Because corporations, quote, have far more power than the workforce, unquote. That's what our best geopolitical friends, hell, England is kind of America's dad. So that's what our dad says about us behind our backs. Because, you know, it's one thing to overhear someone who hates you talk shit. Like, if someone from one of the countries that we've rebelized says America is a dangerous trading partner whose citizens have low qualities of life, stay away from them. It's easy to brush that off. Haters gonna hate. But this is the United Kingdom. These are our BFFs. This is the country that made President George W. Bush's case to the world when our president lied us into the Iraq war just 16 years ago. These are our closest allies, our closest friends, and they don't want to be us because of deregulation. And that should give us pause, especially anyone who votes Republican, because I've been documenting now for 7 years that deregulation is what the Republican Party stands for. It's the one area where there is no hypocrisy. Their words match their actions. Just look at the actions of the George W. Bush administration and all the George W. Bush administration zombies that are now deregulating our government in the Trump administration. They say they're going to deregulate loud and proud, and when in power, they do. When the Republicans had the Trump administration and both houses of Congress, what did they do? They deregulated the banks. This is what they do. They follow it up with action every time when it comes to deregulation. And the Democrats, what makes me so mad about them is they're the hypocrites. They're the ones that say they work for workers and then they deregulate too. So that's where they piss me off. But the Republicans, they tell you that this is their goal and they pursue it with no shame. And the rest of the world talks about us like we're fools for letting it happen. And I think they're right. And I just hope that I live to see the day that us American peasants figure this out and stop voting to cripple our own safety regulators. That's the first step towards making America respectable again. We have to respect our own work, our own government, and ourselves. And the good news is we have our next chance in less than 1 year. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my journey towards enlightenment of kind of understanding the European Union. The next episode is going to be out sometimes before Thanksgiving. I do want to let you know, you'll probably figure it out, but we do have a government funding crisis brewing. So at some point, whether it's in a bonus episode or in the next episode, I will let you know what goes on. My guess is that they're just going to extend the deadline again, but we shall see. But until then, please visit congressionaldish.com, go to the support the show page, because if you like the show, if you want to continue it, even if you don't agree with me, you learned something in here. So if you learned something in Congressional Dish and you want me to keep making these episodes, please pay for the podcast because we don't take ads. We don't let the corporate overlords control us here on this podcast. So it depends on you supporting the podcast so that it can be actually free for everyone. So yeah. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you before Turkey Day. Gobble, gobble. Bye-bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. Is all right if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.